All right, welcome everyone to the inaugural event of this new seminar series on Muslim thought in South Asia, jointly hosted by the Center of South Asia Studies and the Center of Islamic Studies here at Cambridge. Apologies for the delay. We've been delayed by a couple minutes, but we'll get right into it without any further delay. So just to describe the seminar, it brings together emerging scholars and established scholars from various disciplinary backgrounds to discuss ideas and Islam within and beyond the subcontinent, both past and present. The seminar runs on alternate Tuesdays during term time at 5 p.m. And the next event will take place on the 11th of May, when we will be joined by Anand Taneja, who will speak on the ecological thought of Maulana Azad. So before I introduce our speaker today, just a few housekeeping notes. SherAli will speak for around 35 minutes, during which I ask that you please keep yourselves muted. After the presentation, we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion, which you can ask either by using the raise hand function or by indicating that you have a question in the chat box. If you would like me to read out your question, please write it out into the chat. With that, it is my great pleasure to welcome SherAli Tareen to Cambridge, albeit virtually. SherAli is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, where he has been teaching since 2012. He received his PhD in Religion and Islamic Studies from Duke University, and his work explores Muslim thought in modern South Asia, and so aligns very well indeed with the theme of the seminar. But SherAli does this with a particular focus on internal, that is, intra-Muslim debates on questions of law, ethics, and theology, all of which he does with a refreshing attention to the political. This approach, in my view, is best illustrated in his most recent book, which is Defending Muhammad in Modernity, which I have here, which came out in 2019 with the University of Notre Dame Press. It is a really excellent book, which reanimates the contours of the rather infamous Barelvi-Deobandi polemic as a contest between competing political theologies. And in doing so, connects up this debate to wider questions of sovereignty in colonial India. Last year, the book was awarded the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize. So SherAli will be speaking to us today about another topic of debate, and a very relevant one indeed, which I believe comes from his forthcoming book project, Hindu-Muslim Encounters, Power, Politics, Political Theology. So correct me if I'm wrong with the title there, but over to you, SherAli.
Before I start, Taushif, just a quick note. When people are coming in, I'm getting the admit button. I hope you're also getting it, because I'll just, okay, great.
I am. It's because you're a co-host, so don't worry.
Okay,
we'll take care of the admissions.
Yes, just checking that. Terrific, thank you. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you very much, Taushif, for your generous introduction and for this kind invitation to be part of this spectacular speaker series. And thank you to everyone who is tuning in for the gift of your time and attention. I'm really honored and delighted to have this opportunity. Today, I will be sharing with you some fragments of my current book project, tentatively titled The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship. The central question I want to explore with you today is this: how did modern South Asian Muslim scholars, especially the traditionalist ulama, or those scholars educated at madrasas or Muslim seminaries, negotiate the incongruence between the pre-modern context of Muslim empire that informed foundational normative attitudes towards non-Muslims, and the setting of colonial modernity that saw Muslims in South Asia rendered into a numerical as well as a political minority? In simpler words, how did they imagine and engage the legacy of dominant pre-modern texts on Muslim, non-Muslim relations in a world in which the political context of Muslim imperial sovereignty that had informed those texts was no longer available? My main argument is that while the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and the emergence and eventual consolidation of British colonial power and conditions in South Asia served as the immediate backdrop of intensified intra-Muslim contest on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship, paradoxically, at stake and work in these contestations were precisely the logics and promise of an imperial Muslim political theology. In explaining this argument, let me begin by elaborating what I mean by an imperial Muslim political theology. The Islamic legal tradition developed in a pre-modern context of Islamdom that presumed the establishment and maintenance of Muslims as political dominance and theological superiority over non-Muslims as an underlying purpose of law. As the scholar Johann Friedman, in his encyclopedic survey of pre-modern Muslim intellectual attitudes towards non-Muslims, sums up, and I quote him here, "The idea of Muslim superiority is central to the pre-modern Islamic worldview and figures prominently in numerous chapters of Islamic law and tradition." End of quote. This sentiment is best captured in the Prophet's well-known statement, "Islam is exalted and nothing is exalted over it." The principle of Islam's exaltedness, Friedman argued, continued to exert decisive normative pressure on pivotal Muslim intellectual traditions, especially Islamic law, in the centuries following the Prophet's life, with the Abbasid period holding particular significance as the immediate context for the formations of the Muslim jurisprudential tradition. It also served as a crucial underpinning in the formulation of Muslim legal and normative positions concerning the application of a range of questions involving non-Muslims, including the admissibility of testimony, participation in jihad, laws of retribution, and the public display and performance of devotional rituals. Now, obviously, it would be perilous to assume seamless correspondence between the normative ideal and principle of establishing Muslim superiority over non-Muslims and the everyday unfolding of relations among and between different religious communities. Fissures and inconsistencies between scripted ideals and unscripted rhythms of intercommunal encounters are inevitable in any time period. Moreover, the logics, textures, and operations of Muslim caliphal authority and political sovereignty certainly varied across time and space in the pre-modern period. There is no pre-modern monolith. That is not the point. Rather, the point being that an imperial political theology anchored on the assumption of Muslim political and theological supremacy over non-Muslims serves as a critical backdrop to the formation of the canonical sources of knowledge, such as the Hanafi legal canon that dominates South Asia. From the late 18th century onwards, though increasingly a colonized minority, the interpretive canvas that informed South Asian Muslim scholarly engagements with the question of Islam and difference remained deeply anchored in this pre-modern context of Muslim imperial sovereignty. Now, crucially, this did not mean, of course, that South Asian Muslim scholars were somehow stuck in the pre-modern world. To the exact contrary, what I will show today is that the persistence of an imperial Muslim political theology was intimately bound to the conditions, expectations, and pressures of colonial modernity. For a deracinated colonized minority, this moment was saturated with the anxiety of recovering the distant yet urgently attractive fantasy of sovereign power. My main argument today is that with the impossibility of political sovereignty, this desire for sovereign power was increasingly exercised in the realm of everyday ritual life through the drive to preserve and maintain markers of Muslim distinction, sha'air Islam, singular shi'ar Islam, meaning ritual practices and affective registers of everyday life that distinguish religious identity and difference in the public sphere. For the remainder of this talk, I will present and explain two examples to illustrate this broader argument. Among the most fascinating moments of intra-Muslim contest on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim relations concern the context of the Khilafat movement in the early 20th century, almost exactly a century ago. In the second decade of the 20th century, by collaborating with and supporting Gandhi's and the Indian National Congress's non-cooperation movement, a group of prominent Muslim scholars sought to pressure the British colonial government into restoring the Ottoman Caliphate. Though this movement did not succeed as the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922, it brought into view a pressing theological and political dilemma: the normative boundaries of interreligious friendship in the colonial context. Let me briefly describe this intra-Muslim debate sparked by this dilemma by first turning to the thought of the renowned Muslim scholar Abul Kalam Azad, died 1958, who was among Gandhi's major allies and later also key intellectual architect of the Indian Constitution. In a detailed Urdu text peppered with Arabic references, poignantly titled The Arabian Peninsula, Jaziratul Arab, composed in 1920, Azad sought to fashion a political theology that would authorize the ideological project of the Khilafat movement, preserving the Ottoman Caliphate from British colonial onslaught. In the course of this text, Azad wrote in multiple registers. He stitched together a detailed historical narrative of the Caliphate in Islam in an attempt to establish its long-running indispensability, legal discussions on rules of warfare, and emotionally charged exhortations to Indian Muslims, urging them to step up in protecting the Ottoman Caliphate from foreign British assault. Nimbly moving between the Quran, Hadith, the Hanafi legal canon, and historical inquiry, Azad sought to authorize his arguments in a manner, an idiom, that might simultaneously satisfy traditionalist Hanafi legal protocols of Muslim normativity and modern normative sensibilities and expectations. His central theological argument, though, was deeply grounded in an imperial Muslim imaginary. That argument, put simply, was this: the institution of the Caliphate, currently represented by the Ottomans, represented a foundational, indispensable, and non-negotiable tenet of Islam. Azad explained the Caliphate's centrality to Islam with an evocative agricultural analogy. The institution of the Caliphate, he argued, is the root of the Sharia, while obligatory practices like praying and fasting are its branches. The normative foundations of the religion depended on the existence of the Caliphate. Therefore, while not praying or fasting constituted a sin, not aiding a Muslim caliph, especially during a time of war, made one a non-Muslim. In Azad's view, the centrality of the Caliphate to Islam was not only a theological or political imperative, rather the criticality of a singular central locus of Muslim politico-theological power and sovereignty represented a manifestation of a natural universal law of centrality, qanun-e-markaziyat, that pervaded all aspects of life, nature, and cosmology. For instance, the movement and existence of stars hinges and pivots on the centrality of the sun as their source of energy. The body is composed of several organs, each with its specialized function, but their functioning depends on the central organ of the heart. Similarly, in the world of botany, a tree is composed of several elements, including leaves, branches, and flowers, but its sustenance is tethered to a singular center of gravity, the roots. And finally, while there were more than one hallowed site and space in Islam, the central fulcrum of Muslim devotional life and piety was the Kaaba in Mecca. These are all examples that confirm the universality of the law of centrality. The institution of the Caliphate was to Islam, Azad analogized, what the heart, sun, and roots were to the body, stars, and trees. Theologically and cosmologically, the Caliphate was necessary and indispensable. But, and this point is crucial to my larger argument today, Azad's reliance on an imperial Muslim political theology did not in any way undermine his cognizance of the secularizing conditions and claims of British colonial power. In fact, at the centerpiece of his acerbic critique of the British colonial state was the contention that by adopting a policy of aggression against the Ottoman Caliphate, the British had compromised its own official promise of secularism and freedom of religion, mazhabi azadi, for all communities in India. Moreover, by intervening in a matter of religious importance and sensitivity for Indian Muslims, the British had contravened the secular promise of the separation between religion and politics. Therefore, he called on Indian Muslims to avidly collaborate with Gandhi's and the Indian National Congress's non-cooperation movement by severing all civic ties with the colonial state. In fact, Azad went a step further by declaring waging jihad against the British every individual Muslim's religious obligation, fardul ain, since at stake was the protection of the Caliphate from non-Muslim aggression. For Azad, in the political conditions that existed in 1920, it was no longer possible for Indian Muslims to remain loyal citizens of the British Empire while also remaining loyal to the Sharia. Now, in assembling his argument, Azad drew on two intensely contested verses in the Quran, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 60, Al-Mumtahana, relevant parts of which read as follows, and I quote. It says, God does not forbid you from showing kindness to those unbelievers who do not fight you on account of your faith, and neither drive you forth from your homes. God only forbids you to turn in friendship towards those unbelievers who do fight against you because of your faith and drive you forth from your homes or aid others in driving you forth. end of quote. In the context of colonial India, Azad argued Hindus represented the first category of non-Muslims mentioned in these Quranic verses, since they had never attacked Muslim countries, fought them in religion, or been the cause of the expulsion of Muslims from their lands. In stark contrast, the British, with their designs to colonize Arabia and destroy the Ottoman Caliphate, represented and exemplified non-Muslims of the second variety, those who fought Muslims in religion and expelled them from their homes. Now, Azad's program of marrying interreligious hospitality with anti-colonial activism met stiff resistance, however. For instance, the towering late 19th/early 20th century Hanafi traditionalist scholar Ahmad Raza Khan, founder of the famous Barelvi school in South Asia, was furious with Azad and his Khilafat movement colleagues for their push towards Hindu-Muslim collaboration and friendship. I now turn to his rebuttal of Azad. Ahmad Raza Khan counter-argued that to begin, the Ottoman state cannot even be understood as a legitimate caliphate because it lacked prophetic lineage, or more specifically, the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh. Moreover, in a dash of pragmatism, he took strong exception to Azad's call for jihad against the British. Such foolhardy confrontation against a monstrously powerful colonial state will only invite self-destruction, he argued. While speculating that such catastrophic ideas were planted by Gandhi as part of his designs to politically and financially cripple Indian Muslims. But most critically and most relevant to the argument I've been trying to develop here, Khan disagreed vehemently with what he saw as the encouragement of Hindu-Muslim intimacy in the public sphere. Not only was Azad wrong in characterizing Hindus as a community that had never attacked Muslims, for they certainly had done so during multiple episodes of communal violence, but more significantly, legitimating Hindu-Muslim friendship left vulnerable to erasure public markers of Muslim distinction, or sha'air-e-Islam, this key category that I mentioned earlier. Khan was especially livid, for instance, when leaders of the Khilafat movement once invited Gandhi to a mosque on a certain Friday to address the congregants. Handing over the pulpit to a Hindu leader, this elevated and coveted site of the pulpit crystallized an attitude of complete disregard for markers of Muslim distinction. That, in the absence of political sovereignty, indexed sovereign power and the promise of preserving religious identity against the threat of competing others. So, in contrast to Azad, who had sought to recover the dwindling crescent of Muslim imperial sovereignty in the institution of the caliphate, Khan located Muslim sovereign power squarely in the realm of ritual practice and the choreography of the everyday. For the latter, it was not the resurrection of a Muslim state, but the cultivation of markers of Muslim distinction in the public sphere that enshrined the imperial fantasy of sovereignty in the ruins of empire. Now I turn to my second example. And just make sure you're all there. Another issue of contention that best crystallized this point that I'm trying to make in my presentation today was that of cow sacrifice, arguably the most vexatious subject of dispute among the Indian Muslim scholarly elite in the early 20th century. Recently, Hindu nationalist discourses and majoritarian violence directed against minorities like Muslims and Dalits as part of the cow protection movement have attracted tremendous scholarly and journalistic attention as well as alarm. But investing affective and political attachments in the body of the cow as an index and marker of religious purity and superiority is not a solely Hindu phenomenon. The cow has represented a site of tremendous anxiety and opportunity for competing groups of prominent South Asian Muslim scholars as well for at least a century. For instance, the leaders of the Khilafat movement urged abstention from cow sacrifice as a gesture of interreligious hospitality towards the Hindu community. This gesture of abeyance, they argued, was crucial for forging a robust political alliance with the Hindus against the British. Now, their argument was based not on some abstract appeal to pluralism, but on a specific reading of the Islamic legal tradition, drawing on the observation that cow sacrifice is not an obligatory wajib, but only a simply permissible or mubah practice in Islamic law. Hence, refraining from it posed no normative pitfalls. Indian Muslims, they argued, can easily substitute cows with goat and sheep for animal sacrifice in both everyday life and on devotional occasions like Eid. This proposal, however, left opposing scholars like Ahmad Raza Khan aghast. Again, of particular interest to me is the reasoning that went into Khan's protest. I'll explain his reasoning now. Khan elaborated that in the context of colonial India, cow sacrifice represented among the foremost signs and markers of Muslim distinction. And since cow sacrifice was known to be a distinguishing marker of Muslim identity in India, it signified Islam's honor and dominance in the public sphere. In the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, it was in ritual life and performance that power was enshrined. In effect, abandoning such a practice for the appeasement or under the pressure of a non-Muslim community like the Hindus amounted to Islam's humiliation, zillat, an outcome that was antipodal to the underlying motif of the Sharia, establishing Muslim dominance over non-Muslims. Therefore, he agreed that cow sacrifice was certainly not obligatory in and of itself according to the Sharia. But in the specific context of colonial India, deliberately refraining from this practice as an exercise in interreligious hospitality was certainly forbidden. Why? Because such refrain involved the extinction of a marker of Muslim distinction and, in effect, the humiliation of Islam and the elevation of Islam's rivals. Here, I must avert a potential misreading. While articulating and presuming an imperial Muslim political theology, it is not as if Khan was some unhinged exclusivist, oblivious to the reality of British colonial power. Exactly to the contrary. Much like his antagonist, Abul Kalam Azad, whom I discussed earlier, Ahmad Raza Khan was not only keenly aware of the looming British presence, but also closely attuned to the opportunities and benefits afforded by that presence. So, for instance, to give just one among many possible examples, while arguing for the preservation of Muslim markers of distinction, Khan frequently invoked the colonial promise and policy of tolerance towards individual religious communities and of its commitment to ensuring the freedom of religion. Again, the same category that Azad had invoked, Mazhabi Azadi. Pressuring Indian Muslims to abstain from cow sacrifice, he often proclaimed, and I quote him here, represented an abomination that the colonial authorities should never allow. But in trying to demonstrate that precluding Muslims from the ritual of cow sacrifice constituted a breach of religious freedom, he first had to prove that this ritual was indeed wholly and legitimately religious. This he sought to do by citing numerous Quranic verses and the Prophet's sayings that establish cow sacrifice as among the distinguishing markers of Islam. For instance, the most prominent such Quranic verse, which is verse 36 of chapter 22, Al-Hajj, reads as follows. And as for the sacrifice of cattle, we have ordained it for you as among the symbols of distinction designated by God. وَالْبُدْنَ جَعَلْنَاهَا لَكُم مِّن شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ. Having established the religious character of cow sacrifice, Khan proceeded to remind colonial authorities of their duty to honor the principle of religious freedom in an even-handed manner that does not privilege the sensibilities of one group over those of another. As he poignantly pleaded, and I quote him, does religious freedom mean that in affirming the position and priorities of one community, the other is compelled to cease the performance of its critical religious rituals? End of quote. Now, Khan was by no means a liberal secular champion of religious freedom as a normative ideal. What we find here instead is a seemingly illiberal actor's strategic deployment of liberal desires and principles for the advancement of his own ideological and hermeneutical agenda. Similarly, if a staunch traditionalist like Ahmad Raza Khan was not oblivious to modern conditions and categories, on the other hand, it is not as if scholars attached to the Khilafat movement who argued for Hindu-Muslim collaboration were some open-ended pluralists unaware of or uninterested in the normative potency of traditionalist hermeneutical logics anchored in the assumption and context of Muslim empire. Take, for instance, the position of arguably the most intellectually formidable protagonist of the Khilafat movement and a leading Muslim scholar of modern South Asia, Maulvi Abdul Bari, who died in 1926 after a short but prolific life of 47 years. Bari was associated with the famous Farangi Mahal, school of Muslim traditionalism in South Asia, known for its emphasis on rationalist disciplines like logic, philosophy, etc. To Bari now. Even while urging abstinence from cow sacrifice as a gesture of interreligious hospitality with the Hindus, Bari was at pains to emphasize that such abstention should not issue forth under the pressure or coercion of any non-Muslim community. Why? Because suppressing a public marker of Muslim distinction involuntarily under any pressure or coercion contravened the imperial political theology informing the normative ethos and parameters of the Sharia. But no normative landmines imploded if, for purposes of sacrifice, one simply replaced cows with other animals like sheep, camels, or goats of one's own volition. How was one to distinguish coercion from volition is an ambiguity that Bari did not address. But most instructively, Bari anchored his whole case for refraining from cow sacrifice on the very category of public markers of Muslim distinction that the opponents of his view, like Ahmad Raza Khan, had mobilized to argue for the necessity of cow sacrifice. How? By claiming that the caliphate represented a far more critical and monumental marker of Muslim distinction than did cow sacrifice. As he pithily and cuttingly put it, and I quote him here, "What is the cow when put next to the caliphate?" End of quote. In a fascinating move, Bari did not contest or try to refute his opponent's claim that cow sacrifice represented an important marker of Muslim distinction in the South Asian context. He readily admitted that it was so. Moreover, he was also in agreement with the likes of Ahmad Raza Khan that Indian Muslims must not abandon cow sacrifice under the coercion or pressure of Hindus or their leaders like Gandhi. Bari's argument for halting cow sacrifice as a gesture of interreligious hospitality, thus, did not rest on vitiating cow sacrifice as a ritual practice or on diminishing or challenging its importance to the ritual lives of South Asian Muslims. Instead, he framed his program for forging Hindu-Muslim unity as what he intriguingly termed an exception to the norm, kharqul ada, whereby a marker of Muslim distinction, that of cow sacrifice, was, so to say, itself sacrificed to safeguard a much more vital and coveted marker of Muslim distinction, the caliphate. In essence, Bari packaged the cultivation of Hindu-Muslim harmony as a departure from the norm, kharqul ada, necessitated by a moment of politico-theological tribulation for the Muslim community with the Ottoman Caliphate under grave threat. And by so doing, and this is the main point I'm trying to make here, he astutely maintained his normative loyalty to the principle of Muslim exceptionalism, while also justifying the temporary exception of Hindu-Muslim friendship precipitated by political necessity. Note that Bari was in complete agreement with his antagonists like Ahmad Raza Khan that giving up cow sacrifice because of the pressure of non-Muslim community was unlawful. However, in contrast to Khan, he shifted the focus of the conversation from anxious prognostication over the potential pitfalls of abandoning a ritual practice to elaborating the purposes and benefits of pursuing unity and friendship with the Hindu other. Although, abandoning cow sacrifice was only a means to a much greater cause, that of guarding a foundational pivot of Muslim identity, the caliphate. So to close this second example, the cow I've tried to show here thus represented a discursive and material field inhabiting a variety of conflicting normative projects and desires. On the one hand, for a scholar like Ahmad Raza Khan, the cow, or rather the death of the cow, presented the possibility of securing Muslim power and distinction. From the ruins of political sovereignty, the erasure of the cow offered the promise of an imperial political theology, nestled in the comforting fiction of communal dominance. If the cow were left unsacrificed, the coherence and integrity of this political theology unraveled. On the other hand, Abdul Bari also considered the cow pregnant with power. Though for him, power was enshrined in the imperative of restoring a coveted marker of Muslim political sovereignty, the institution of the caliphate. While maintaining Muslim dominance in the public sphere through the public performance of ritual practice was important, its significance paled in comparison to the caliphate's aura and sacrality. The point being, notice the way this intra-Muslim or intra-minority debate over cow sacrifice and Hindu-Muslim friendship involves the thorny negotiation of modern colonial conditions and the legacy of pre-modern Islamic legal and normative imaginaries and assumptions. To conclude, this challenge of translating a legal discursive landscape tethered to the assumption of Muslim empire in a radically transformed set of political conditions also holds far-reaching implications in the post-colonial moment, for instance, in settings like Pakistan. To give just one among many possible examples, notice the persistence of pre-modern jurisprudential categories in the following comments by the prominent traditionalist scholar of the Deoband school, Muhammad Yusuf Banouri, died 1977, in the aftermath of the 1974 amendment in the Pakistani constitution that declared the Ahmadis as outside the fold of Islam. Banouri wrote, and I quote him here, "Before the constitutional amendment, the normative status of the Ahmadis was that of hostile unbelievers, kuffar-e muharibin. And after the amendment, their status is that of non-Muslim minorities under the protection of Muslim rule, or in other words, that of dhimmis. On the condition, of course, that they live in Pakistan as minorities and don't lay claim on being Muslim." End of quote. Again, notice that Benouri's mobilization of categories like dhimmi and muharib, or hostile unbeliever, clearly indicates that he's operating according to a pre-modern Muslim imperial jurisprudential framework, while simultaneously seeking to align that framework with the calculus of modern state sovereignty. This attempted alignment generates a vexing conundrum. How is one to maintain normative fidelity with the conceptual vocabulary of a discursive tradition that is not so easily translatable into the requirements and protocols of modern citizenship and constitutional rights? Of course, as the Ahmadi example crystallizes, the exclusionary politics and mechanisms of the modern state are often dramatically more violent and durable than the imperial logics of sovereignty governing pre-modern empires. My point thus is not to draw a fictitious contrast between pre-modern intolerance and modern liberal tolerance, or to present South Asian ulama as mired in the long exhausted fiction of Muslim empire. Rather, through these examples, I have sought to highlight an important and perhaps less examined dimension of the problem of interreligious relations in South Asia, namely the intra-minority debates and tensions generated through the encounter between the legacy of pre-colonial discursive traditions and norms and the conditions and institutions of colonial modernity and, more recently, the post-colonial state. This encounter I've tried to show today has represented a site of considerable aspiration, anxiety, and intellectual fermentation. Ultimately, the analysis presented in this presentation highlights the importance of imagining a horizon of interreligious and Hindu-Muslim friendship that is neither imperiled by pathological inheritances of imperial political theologies and nor leavened by the seductive yet frequently sour promises of modern secular power and state sovereignty. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, SherAli, for that really rich and really invigorating presentation.